I sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Apex Global Holdings, sipping a sparkling water while I looked down at the city skyline. 20 floors below in my former startup's office, my older brother Jason and my parents were popping champagne. Yesterday, they had orchestrated a hostile takeover. Knowing Apex Global was about to buy my tech company for $5 million, my parents had secretly bought off my board of directors and fired me as CEO. They physically escorted me out of the building, tossing a cardboard box of my desk items at my feet. My father told me, "Girls don't need this kind of money. Your brother will secure the family legacy." They thought they had successfully stolen my life's work, leaving me with nothing but a worthless founder's title. They didn't know that 3 years ago, before I ever incorporated the company or hired a single employee, I had registered the core AI source code's patent and copyright strictly under my own name. The company they just stole was essentially a hollow shell. It only had a temporary license to use my code. The CEO of Apex Global walked into the room, slid a massive cashier's check across the table, and shook my hand. I had just sold the core intellectual property directly to them for the full $5 million. My phone buzzed. It was a live feed from the startup's office. Apex Global's legal team had just walked in, officially terminating the buyout of Jason's company and serving him with a $50 million lawsuit for attempting to sell fraudulent, unlicensed assets. I watched my brother drop his champagne glass in pure terror. I put the check in my designer purse and walked out, leaving my family to drown in federal litigation. But 4 years ago, I was still the daughter who believed that being brilliant would eventually be enough. I need to go back to the night I wrote the first working prototype of the algorithm that would become everything, alone, in a studio apartment I could barely afford, 3 years before any of them thought my work was worth stealing. My name is Chloe Whitmore. I graduated top of my class in computer science, turned down 2 competing offers from companies whose names you'd recognize, and spent 18 months building, testing, and rebuilding a machine learning architecture for predictive supply chain optimization that, by the time I finally got it working, could do in minutes what entire logistics departments spent weeks doing by hand. I didn't have investors. I didn't have a team. I had a laptop, a folding table, and a stubbornness my mother used to call difficult. Whenever it produced results my brother's more socially acceptable ambitions never quite managed. I founded Veritas Logic the same year I finished the core algorithm, funding the first round entirely from savings, and a small angel investment from a former professor who'd watched me solve a problem in her lab that 3 PhD candidates had abandoned. Within 2 years, Veritas had 11 employees, a handful of enterprise clients quietly testing the platform, and a valuation that had started attracting attention from exactly the kind of acquirers who build empires by buying other people's genius at a discount. My parents had never been particularly interested in the company during those early years, not out of malice, I told myself at the time, but simply because neither of them fully understood what I did for a living, and neither of them had ever needed to pretend otherwise. That changed the moment Veritas started appearing in trade publications. The moment my father's golf partners began asking him, with newfound respect, about his daughter's tech company. It was around then that the conversation about Jason started. "Your brother's between opportunities right now," my mother said. Over a dinner I remember specifically because it was the first time either of my parents had asked a single detailed question about my work. "It would mean so much to your father if you found him something at the company, something with a title. He's got such good instincts for people, Chloe, and honestly, a company needs a strong number 2. Someone who can be the face of things while your head's down in the technical work." I want to be honest about why I said yes. It wasn't naivety, not entirely. I understood on some level what I was inviting into a company I'd built alone. But I had spent 29 years being told, in 100 small and large ways, that my accomplishments existed to be shared, softened, made comfortable for the people around me who found my success slightly too large a thing to simply admire without needing a piece of it. Giving Jason a Chief Operating Officer title felt, at the time, like the smallest possible price for finally being allowed to enjoy my own success without an undertone of resentment at every family dinner. Jason had never run anything larger than a failed craft beer distributorship that our parents had quietly buylaid out twice. He showed up to Veritas 3 days a week, took credit in client meetings for strategic decisions he'd learned about the morning of, and spent the rest of his time cultivating relationships with board members I'd recruited specifically for their technical credibility, not their loyalty to my family. I noticed the shift in board dynamics roughly 8 months before the Apex Global offer arrived. Small things at first. Board members siding with Jason on minor operational votes, where his opinion carried no particular technical weight. My father appearing at quarterly meetings he had no formal role attending, always seated beside whichever board member seemed most persuadable that quarter. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that family, whatever its complications, didn't actively conspire against the very success it claimed to be proud of. I was wrong in a way that would take a $5 million acquisition offer to fully reveal. Apex Global's interest came through their venture arm, initially framed as a strategic partnership discussion that evolved over 6 weeks of diligence into a full acquisition offer. $5 million for Veritas Logic, contingent on retaining key technical staff, and crucially, clean, uncontested ownership of the company's core intellectual property. I remember reading that clause during the term sheet review and feeling a small, private flicker of relief that I'd been careful years earlier, in exactly the way that clause was asking me to be careful. I hadn't told my family about that carefulness. I hadn't told anyone, actually, except my IP attorney, a meticulous, unflappable woman named Renata Cole who had drafted, 3 years before Veritas Logic existed as a legal entity, the patent and copyright registration for the core algorithm entirely in my own name as an individual inventor. When I incorporated Veritas 6 months later, the company received a licensing agreement to use that technology, not ownership of it. It was a structure Renata had recommended almost offhandedly, the kind of standard protective advice she gave every solo founder client, and one I'd agreed to without fully appreciating at the time how completely it would someday matter. The board meeting to finalize the Apex Global deal was scheduled for a Tuesday. I walked in prepared to sign paperwork I'd spent months negotiating, and I walked out 40 minutes later with a cardboard box of desk items and a security escort. I understood the moment I saw my father seated at the head of the boardroom table, a chair that had never once in 3 years belonged to him, exactly what had happened before anyone said a single word. "The board has voted," Jason said, and I watched him fail almost comically to keep the satisfaction out of his voice, "to remove you as CEO, effective immediately." Given the pending Apex transaction, the board felt new leadership would provide better continuity and stability going forward. "Continuity," I repeated. "You've been here 8 months, Jason. You don't know how the algorithm works. You've never once opened the code base." "I don't need to write the code," he said. "I need to run the company. That's what real leadership looks like, Chloe, not hiding behind a laptop." My father cleared his throat then, and I watched him settle into the particular satisfied posture he adopted whenever he believed he was delivering wisdom rather than cruelty. "This is for the best, sweetheart. You built something impressive, no one's denying that. But a $5 million sale, running the surviving entity, negotiating with corporate lawyers, that's a different kind of pressure. Girls don't need this kind of money, not really, not the way a family needs it. Jason's got a wife to think about starting a family with. He'll secure the legacy properly. You'll always be part of this, of course. We're not cutting you out entirely." I looked around that boardroom, at board members I had personally recruited, now unable to meet my eyes, at my mother nodding along with an expression of practiced, sorrowful agreement, at my brother already reaching for the term sheet like a man claiming furniture at an estate sale. And I felt something in me go very quiet, the specific, focused quiet that had once let me debug a corrupted training pipeline for 11 straight hours without losing my composure once. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I let the security guard walk me to my own office, watched him place my monitor, my desk plant, and 3 years of small personal effects into a cardboard box with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a man who did this several times a year, and had stopped finding it remarkable. My father's voice followed me to the elevator, delivered with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just won something. "Girls don't need this kind of money. Your brother will secure the family legacy." I stood on the sidewalk outside the building I'd leased, furnished, and filled with people I'd hired myself, holding a cardboard box that contained nothing of any real value to what I'd actually built, and I smiled. Not because I wasn't devastated, I was. Somewhere underneath the calm, a part of me was grieving a family I'd apparently never fully had, in the way I'd always assumed I did. I smiled because none of them, not my father, not my mother, not Jason standing in my old office already rearranging the furniture, had the faintest idea that the company they had just stolen from me didn't actually own the one thing that made it worth $5 million. I didn't go home that night. I went to Renata's office, arriving 20 minutes before her final appointment of the day, still holding the cardboard box of desk items because some stubborn, wounded part of me hadn't wanted to leave it in my car like something disposable. Renata took one look at my face and cleared her calendar for the rest of the afternoon. "Tell me what happened," she said, and I did, in the flat, precise language I'd learned to use for delivering bad news to investors. The board vote, my father's chair at the head of the table, Jason's hand already reaching for the term sheet. The specific cruelty of girls don't need this kind of money delivered like a mercy. Renata listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't offer sympathy, which I was grateful for, because sympathy would have cracked something in me I needed to keep sealed for at least a few more days. Instead, she opened her laptop and pulled up a folder I recognized immediately, 3 years old, meticulously organized, the patent registration and copyright filings for the core algorithm. Every document bearing a single name as sole inventor and rights holder. Chloe Whitmore, not Veritas Logic Inc. "Walk me through exactly what you remember about the licensing structure," Renata said, "because I want you to hear yourself say it out loud. I think you already know exactly how much power you're still holding, and I think some part of you hasn't let yourself believe it yet. The patent and copyright are mine," I said slowly, feeling the shape of it settle into something solid as I spoke. "Individually, Veritas never owned the core IP. When I incorporated, the company received a licensing agreement, a revocable license, granting Veritas the right to use the technology in its products, but ownership never transferred. You structured it that way from the beginning." "That's right," Renata said. "Which means the company your family just stole from you is, legally, an empty shell wearing a $5 million price tag it has no right to. Veritas Logic has clients, employees, a brand, a cap table, and none of that is worth anything to Apex Global without the algorithm underneath it, which they cannot acquire through a corporate transaction with Veritas, because Veritas doesn't own it and never did." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest that wasn't quite triumph, yet grief doesn't clear a room that easily, but was, at minimum, the return of a clarity I'd been too devastated, an hour earlier, to fully access. "I want to revoke the license," I said. "I assumed you would," Renata said, already pulling up a template on her screen. "As sole owner of the IP, you retain the contractual right to terminate Veritas's license under Section 4.2 of the original agreement, provided you give written notice. Given the timing of your removal as CEO, which I'll note occurred through what sounds like an improperly disclosed conflict of interest among board members your family compensated for their votes, I'd argue you have more than sufficient grounds to terminate immediately, without a cure period. We can have the notice drafted and delivered by courier first thing tomorrow morning." "Do it," I said. "And Renata, I want to talk to Apex Global directly, before Jason gets anywhere near the closing table." She looked at me for a moment, something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "You understand that once you do that, there's no path back to reconciliation with your family, not a real one." I thought about my father's voice in that boardroom, satisfied, certain, utterly untroubled by what he was taking from me. Girls don't need this kind of money. I understood that the moment they put my things in a box, I said. The notice terminating Veritas Logic's license went out by courier at 9 the next morning, delivered directly to the company's registered legal counsel, with a copy to Jason personally. I didn't wait for a response. Renata and I spent that same morning drafting a direct outreach to Apex Global's general counsel, a carefully worded letter establishing, with the same meticulous documentation she'd maintained for 3 years, that I was the sole owner of the intellectual property their acquisition offer had been built around, and that any transaction proceeding through Veritas Logic without my direct involvement would be acquiring an asset the seller did not have the legal right to convey. Apex Global's response came within 6 hours, considerably faster than either of us expected, in the form of a call from their chief legal officer, a measured, sharp-voiced woman named Diane Ockhaffer, requesting an urgent meeting. "I want to be direct with you, Ms. Whitmore," she said, once we'd exchanged the necessary pleasantry. "This letter raises serious concerns for us. Our diligence team has spent 6 weeks reviewing Veritas Logic's asset structure. If what you're describing is accurate, we've been negotiating in good faith to acquire intellectual property the company cannot actually transfer. That's not a paperwork issue. That's a material misrepresentation that could expose us both to significant liability if we proceed without resolving it." "It's accurate," I said. "I can have my attorney forward the original patent and copyright registrations within the hour. I'd also recommend your diligence team ask Veritas's current leadership to produce the master cryptographic keys and IP registration documentation directly. I suspect they'll find that harder than they expect." There was a brief, telling pause on the line. "You're saying the current leadership doesn't have access to those materials?" "I'm saying," I said, "that I never gave them to anyone. I own them, I always have." I could hear, in the silence that followed, the particular sound of a very expensive deal quietly beginning to come apart at its foundation. Diane thanked me, professionally, carefully, and ended the call promising to be in touch within 24 hours, once her team had reviewed the documentation. I spent that evening in Renata's conference room, watching her file the license termination with the state's IP registry, watching 3 years of careful, unglamorous legal foresight finally reveal itself as the single most important decision I'd ever made about my own company. The call that told me everything had already started unraveling on the other side came the next morning, not from Apex Global, but from a former colleague still working inside Veritas, a junior engineer named Priya who'd stayed loyal to me quietly, texting rather than calling, aware of exactly how closely Jason had started monitoring internal communications. "Diligence team just called an emergency meeting with Jason," she wrote. "They're asking for the master keys and the IP filing docs. He's stalling, telling them it's a minor paperwork delay. He looks like he's about to throw up." I read the message twice, sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in over an hour, and felt, for the first time since the cardboard box and the security escort, something close to peace. They had taken my title. They had taken my office, my desk plant, my 3 years of built trust with a board I'd recruited myself. They had never had the one thing that made any of it worth stealing. The emergency diligence meeting, as Priya would later describe it to me in far more detail than she probably should have risked sharing, took place in Veritas's largest conference room, the one I'd personally chosen the furniture for 2 years earlier, with Apex Global's team seated on one side of the table and Jason, increasingly alone, on the other. "We need the master cryptographic keys for the core algorithm," Diane Ockhaffer's lead diligence attorney had said, according to Priya, "and the original patent and copyright registration documents. This should be straightforward. Our understanding was that this was standard closing documentation." "There's been a slight administrative delay," Jason said, and Priya told me later that his voice had already started carrying the particular strain of a man improvising in real time. "Our former CEO handled a lot of the technical documentation personally. We're in the process of transitioning that over." "Your former CEO," the attorney repeated. "The founder, the one your board removed 3 days before closing." "The timing was coincidental," Jason said, "purely operational. We felt new leadership." "Mr. Whitmore," Diane's voice, Priya said, had gone flat in a way that made the entire room go quiet. "I'm going to ask you a direct question and I need a direct answer. Do you, or does anyone currently employed by Veritas Logic, have access to the master keys and IP registration for the core algorithm this acquisition is built around?" The silence that followed, Priya told me, lasted long enough that 2 board members exchanged a look neither of them managed to hide. "We're working on resolving a temporary access issue," Jason finally said. "That's not a yes," Diane said. "My father, who had insisted on attending the meeting despite having no formal role at the company, apparently attempted to intervene at that point, launching into an explanation about family business structures and founder transitions that Priya described as increasingly unhinged, until Diane cut him off entirely. "Sir, I'd ask you not to speak again in this meeting unless you're prepared to answer for your own role in a board vote that appears to have removed the sole legal owner of the asset we're here to acquire." I received the call from Diane Ackhaffer 40 minutes later, her voice carrying a controlled, professional urgency that told me everything I needed to know before she said a single detail. "Ms. Whitmore, I'd like to schedule an in-person meeting today if you're available. I think it's time we discuss this directly, and I think it's time you brought the original documentation with you." I arrived at Apex Global's headquarters 90 minutes later, Renata beside me, a leather portfolio containing 3 years of meticulously maintained patent filings, copyright registrations, and the original licensing agreement between myself and Veritas Logic resting on the conference table between us, and 6 of the most senior people, at a company worth considerably more than the $5 million my family had been fighting over. I laid it out for them with the same clarity I'd once used to explain the algorithm's architecture to skeptical enterprise clients. Methodical, unemotional, every claim backed immediately by a document that made argument unnecessary. The original patent registration, filed 3 years before Veritas Logic existed as a legal entity. The copyright filing for the core code base, registered under my name alone. The licensing agreement Renata had drafted, granting Veritas a revocable right to use the technology, never ownership of it. The termination notice, sent the previous morning, formally severing that license the moment my removal as CEO made clear exactly what kind of company I was now dealing with. "To be direct," I told the room, "Veritas Logic currently has no legal right to use, license, or sell the technology your acquisition offer was built around. Jason Whitmore cannot produce master keys he was never given access to because I never gave them to anyone outside my own legal counsel. The company your team has spent 6 weeks conducting diligence on is, as of yesterday morning, a shell with clients and a brand and absolutely nothing underneath them." Diane Ackhaffer studied the documents for a long, silent moment, then looked up at me with an expression that held something close to respect. "And you're the sole owner." "I've been the sole owner since before Veritas Logic had a single employee," I said. "My family found that detail inconvenient. That doesn't make it less true." She exchanged a glance with her general counsel. A brief, wordless conversation conducted entirely in the particular shorthand of executives who had clearly navigated collapsing deals before, and understood exactly how quickly they needed to move once one started unraveling. "Ms. Whitmore," Diane said, "I think it's time we discussed acquiring this technology directly from you, structured as an asset purchase rather than a corporate acquisition. Same valuation your board originally negotiated with Veritas, $5 million, paid directly to you as the verified owner of record. We'd want exclusivity on the agreement signed today, given how quickly this situation appears to be deteriorating on the other side." "I'll want my attorney to review the terms," I said, "but in principle, yes, I'm prepared to move quickly." We spent the next several hours in a smaller conference room while Renata and Apex Global's legal team built the direct purchase agreement from the ground up. Clean, uncontested, structured entirely around intellectual property that had never at any point belonged to anyone but me. Diane's team worked with the specific urgency of a company that understood exactly how much liability exposure they'd narrowly avoided. And by early evening, the agreement sat finished on the table between us, requiring nothing but signatures. "There's one more thing," Diane said, as her assistant prepared the final paperwork. "Given what your family attempted here, and I want to be careful with my language, but knowingly misrepresenting IP ownership to induce a $5 million acquisition is not a minor issue for us. Our legal team intends to pursue this aggressively against Veritas Logic and its board. I want you to know that before you sign, in case it affects your decision." I thought about a cardboard box on a sidewalk. I thought about my father's voice, satisfied and certain, delivering a sentence he'd clearly rehearsed. "Girls don't need this kind of money." "It doesn't affect my decision at all," I said. "If anything, sign faster." The next morning, I sat in Apex Global's glass-walled conference room. 20 floors above a startup office where I knew, from Priya's increasingly frantic texts, my family was already celebrating a closing they believed was minutes away. I signed my name at the bottom of the asset purchase agreement, watched Diane's CEO slide a cashier's check across the table toward me, and felt something in my chest finally, completely unclench for the first time in 4 days. My phone buzzed once, a single message from Priya, timestamped to the exact minute Apex Global's legal team would be walking through Veritas's front doors 20 floors below. They're here not for the signing. Jason just saw their faces, he knows. Priya's second message arrived less than a minute after the first. This one no longer a text, but a shaky, 12-second video she must have recorded from behind a half-open supply closet door, angled just enough to catch the main office floor without revealing she was filming. I watched it standing in Apex Global's elevator bank, the cashier's check still warm inside my purse. 5 Apex Global attorneys walked through Veritas's front doors in a tight, unhurried formation. The specific choreography of people who had done this exact kind of visit many times before and felt no particular urgency about performing sympathy for the room they were about to dismantle. Jason stood near the champagne table, a half-raised glass in one hand, his expression sliding from confused welcome into something else entirely as the lead attorney extended a folder rather than a handshake. I didn't need Priya's video to know what was inside it. I'd watched Renata prepare a copy of the same documents that morning. Formal notice terminating acquisition discussions with Veritas Logic, Inc. on grounds of material misrepresentation of assets, accompanied by a $50 million complaint alleging fraud, breach of warranty, and attempted sale of intellectual property the company did not own. The champagne glass, according to Priya's video, and the account she gave me later with the specific, relish-tinged detail of someone who had spent 8 months watching Jason take credit for other people's work, slipped from his hand and shattered against the office floor roughly 4 seconds after he understood what he was holding. My mother's voice, audible even through Priya's shaky phone audio, rose into something high and disbelieving. There has to be some mistake. We have a $5 million deal. We signed. You signed an agreement to sell intellectual property you never owned, the lead attorney said, her voice carrying the flat, unbothered clarity of someone entirely unmoved by a room's collective shock. The actual owner sold it to us directly yesterday. This company currently holds no legal license to use the algorithm underlying every product it sells. I'd strongly recommend you retain separate counsel immediately, given the scope of the exposure here. I turned my phone face down after that. I didn't need to watch my father's expression collapse in real time, didn't need to hear whatever he said next, because I already knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with 3 years of careful legal architecture, exactly how the rest of that afternoon would unfold. It unfolded in the following weeks, largely as Renata had predicted. Veritas Logic's board, several of whom had accepted quiet payments from my parents in exchange for the vote that removed me, discovered that their complicity in the misrepresentation exposed them to personal liability far beyond anything they'd bargained for in exchange for a bribe they'd assumed was low risk. 2 of them retained their own attorneys within days and began cooperating with Apex Global's litigation in exchange for reduced exposure, providing documentation of the exact conversations in which my father and Jason had arranged their votes. Veritas Logic filed for bankruptcy protection 11 weeks later, its client contracts worthless without the underlying technology, its legal fees mounting faster than its remaining cash reserves could absorb, its brand, the one thing Jason had actually contributed to, in his 8 months of taking meetings and posing for the company's annual report photo, collapsing under the specific, well-documented public embarrassment of a $50 million fraud lawsuit that several trade publications covered in detail, always including, prominently, the detail I hadn't leaked but somehow found its way out anyway, that the company's actual founder, the one who'd built the technology from nothing, had been the one who exposed it. My father called 11 times in the first week after the story broke. I let each one go to voicemail. I listened to exactly one of them, on a flight to somewhere I hadn't decided yet, his voice cracking through an apology that arrived only after the money was already lost, only after the golf partners had presumably stopped asking about his daughter's tech company for reasons that were no longer flattering. "Chloe, please, we didn't understand what we were doing. Your brother's facing real charges now. We could lose the house covering the legal fees. Please, you have to help us. We're your family." I deleted the voicemail without finishing it. Some sentences don't require a full listen to understand exactly what they're asking for. And I had already spent 29 years giving people the benefit of a doubt I no longer owed anyone who'd stood in a boardroom and watched a security guard walk me to an elevator with a cardboard box. My mother texted twice. I didn't respond to either. Jason didn't reach out at all, which I understood, eventually, as its own kind of honesty. The first entirely honest thing he'd offered me since the day he walked into Verita's Logic with a chief operating officer title he hadn't earned, and a plan he'd apparently been building for months before I ever noticed the board's votes shifting beneath me. I cashed the check 3 days after landing in a city I'd chosen specifically, because no one in it knew my last name yet. I spent the first month doing very little, sleeping late, walking unfamiliar streets, letting the specific, disorienting quiet of no longer needing anyone's approval settle slowly into something that finally felt less like grief and more like room to breathe. I started a new company 4 months later, smaller, quieter, built from the ground up with a legal structure Renata, and I designed together before a single line of code existed. Every safeguard doubled, every lesson from Verita's Logic folded permanently into the foundation of whatever I built next. I think, sometimes, about the woman who once believed that giving her family a piece of her success would finally earn her the recognition she'd spent a lifetime working for. I don't recognize her completely anymore, not because I've forgotten her, but because I've become someone who no longer needs anyone's permission to know exactly what she's worth. My father was right about one thing in the end, though not in the way he meant it. Girls don't need this kind of money. We just need someone to stop standing between us and the work we already